New Orleans, Louisiana. Would you stand your ground if the person with all the power wanted to silence you? Elijah Walker stood in the middle of the courtroom, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He was only 13, but today he had no choice but to stand his ground. His father's life depended on it. New Orleans had always been home, but this courtroom felt foreign, cold, rigid, and unwelcoming. The heavy wooden benches, the glares from suited lawyers, and the judge's towering bench all reminded him that power didn't always favor the truth. Today, he wasn't just any witness. He was the only one standing between justice and a system built to silence people like him. His father, Samuel Walker, was a hard-working single parent who had never been in trouble with the law. But that hadn't stopped the police from accusing him of a crime he didn't commit. They said he had stolen from his employer, a crime that came out of nowhere, without evidence, without reason. Just an accusation that threatened to take everything away from them. Elijah knew the truth. He had seen the papers, the numbers that didn't add up, the missing documents that mysteriously reappeared after his father's arrest. But none of that had mattered because the judge handling the case had a history of ruling against black defendants, no matter the facts. And now, that same judge was staring at him, waiting for him to speak. "Elijah Walker," the judge called, his voice deep and authoritative. "Step forward." Elijah's feet felt heavy, but he forced himself to move. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room. His father, sitting at the defense table, gave him a reassuring nod. He had always told Elijah to tell the truth no matter how hard it was. That advice had never mattered more than it did right now. As he reached the witness stand, he took a deep breath. The prosecutor leaned forward, studying him closely, waiting for him to trip over his words. Elijah wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "You understand that you are under oath?" the judge asked, his gaze piercing. "Yes, Your Honor," Elijah replied, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. The prosecutor stood buttoning his suit jacket. "Elijah, do you know why your father was arrested?" Elijah met his gaze, refusing to look away. "Yes, because someone lied." A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge tapped his gavel once, silencing them. "Stick to the facts, young man." Elijah clenched his fists. "The fact is, my father didn't steal anything. The real thief covered his tracks, and now my dad is paying the price for it." The prosecutor smirked, flipping through his notes. "That's quite a claim. Do you have proof?" Elijah reached into his pocket, his fingers tightening around the folded paper. He had spent nights searching for the missing financial records, nights convincing himself that telling the truth was worth the risk. Slowly, he unfolded the paper and placed it on the stand. "Where are you watching from, and what time is it?" David Walker had always been a man of integrity, a respected community leader, a father who worked tirelessly to provide for his son, and a neighbor who looked out for those around him. But none of that mattered the night he was arrested. The charge, burglary, the evidence, a single witness statement. No fingerprints, no video footage, no real investigation, just an accusation, one that had been enough to turn his world upside down. The case had been rushed to trial. The system had decided his guilt before he even had a chance to prove his innocence. And the man in charge of deciding his fate, Judge Barrett. Everyone knew Barrett's reputation. He had spent years on the bench, his rulings swift and brutal. His pattern was undeniable. Black defendants rarely stood a chance in his courtroom. He dismissed motions, denied appeals, and pushed cases through faster than the defense had time to prepare. And now, He sat at the front of the courtroom, staring down at Elijah Walker. Elijah had heard the whispers. He had seen the news stories about his father's case, the quiet murmurs in the community about how they had set him up. But Elijah didn't care about speculation. He cared about the truth. And today, he was going to reveal it. As he sat next to his father's attorney, Elijah clenched his fists beneath the table. He had spent days searching, poring over files, double-checking details that didn't add up. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a cop. He was just a kid desperate to clear his father's name. And now he had the one thing no one else did: proof. Judge Barrett tapped his gavel, bringing the courtroom to order. "Elijah Walker," he called, his voice deep, commanding, "Step forward." Elijah took a deep breath and rose from his seat. Every eye in the room followed his movements. The prosecutor smirked as if daring him to speak. Elijah met his gaze head-on. "Young man," the prosecutor said, flipping through his papers, "do you understand the charges against your father?" "Yes," Elijah said. "I also understand they're false." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Judge Barrett's gavel came down sharply. "There will be no outbursts," he warned. Elijah stood tall. "The real outburst is what this system did to my father." The prosecutor leaned forward. "That's quite a claim. Do you have proof?" Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document, his fingers gripping it tightly. He locked eyes with his father, who gave him the smallest nod. Then, without hesitation, Elijah handed the paper to the defense attorney. "This," he said firmly, "proves that my father was set up." Gasps filled the courtroom. Journalists scrambled for their pens, and even the jury shifted forward, eager to see what had just been revealed. Judge Barrett's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Elijah knew then this case wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about exposing something much bigger. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers sat stiffly at their tables. Reporters whispered to one another, and activists filled the gallery, waiting for the moment that could change everything. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken battle unfolding before it had even begun. Judge Barrett sat tall at the bench, his expression cold and calculating. He had seen countless defendants before him, most of whom never stood a chance. Today, however, was different. Today, a 13-year-old boy was about to challenge him. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Elijah Walker, step forward." Elijah rose from his seat, his hands clenched at his sides to keep them from shaking. His father, David, gave him a steady nod from across the room. With every step toward the witness stand, Elijah felt the weight of what he was about to do pressing against him. He wasn't just speaking for his father. He was speaking for every person Judge Barrett had silenced before. As Elijah reached the stand, Judge Barrett leaned forward slightly, smirking. "You know the consequences of lying under oath, don't you, boy?" Elijah didn't flinch. His voice was clear, unwavering. "I know the consequences of telling the truth, too." A ripple of gasps swept through the courtroom. The judge's smirk faltered for just a second before he slammed his gavel. "Order in the court." The prosecutor, standing to Elijah's right, adjusted his tie and approached with slow, deliberate steps. "Elijah, you claim your father is innocent." He flipped through a stack of papers, pretending to search for something. "Yet the evidence says otherwise. One witness identified him at the scene. What do you say to that?" Elijah lifted his chin. "I say one witness isn't evidence." The courtroom murmured, and Judge Barrett shot a glare toward the spectators. Silence, Elijah continued. There were no fingerprints, no security footage, no investigation beyond that one statement. My father was arrested because it was easy, not because it was right. The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line. Do you have proof of this claim? Elijah reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the folded paper he had carried for days. He met his father's gaze one last time before pulling it out and handing it to the defense attorney. The attorney unfolded the document, scanning its contents before his eyebrows shot up. The room hushed as he turned to the judge. Your Honor, this is a sworn statement from the real perpetrator, the same man the police refused to investigate. The courtroom exploded into whispers. Reporters scrambled to take notes, and Judge Barrett's face darkened. He banged his gavel 3 times, but the tension in the room had already shifted. The balance of power had changed. The judge leaned forward, his voice laced with warning. Truth or lie, kid? Let's find out who comes out on top. Elijah met his eyes without fear. I'm not afraid of the truth, are you? The tension in the room was suffocating. For the first time, Judge Barrett had lost control of his own courtroom. Elijah had just turned the tables. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor stepped forward, his smirk widening as he faced Elijah. The tension in the room was suffocating, every breath measured, every movement calculated. This was the moment the prosecution had been waiting for, the moment to dismantle Elijah's claims. Elijah, the prosecutor said smoothly, flipping through his notes. Do you have any proof that your father wasn't at the scene of the crime? Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands didn't shake as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Without hesitation, he handed it to the defense attorney. This is a receipt, Elijah stated firmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. The defense lawyer took the paper, his brow furrowing as he scanned its contents. Then, suddenly, his eyes widened in shock. He turned toward the judge, lifting the paper high for the court to see. Your Honor, this receipt is time-stamped exactly when the crime was committed. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to take notes, camera shutters clicking in rapid succession. The gallery erupted into murmurs, the weight of the revelation settling in. The prosecutor's smirk vanished. He grabbed the paper from the defense attorney's hands, his eyes darting across the details. His lips pressed into a thin line before he scoffed, shaking his head. Impossible, he spat. Where was this found? Elijah turned his gaze directly toward Judge Barrett. The room seemed to hold its breath as he spoke. In your evidence room, buried under paperwork. The silence that followed was deafening. The defense lawyer took a step forward. This proves David Walker wasn't anywhere near the crime scene. This is clear evidence of misconduct. The entire courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, journalists typed furiously, and the gallery whispered among themselves. The balance of power had shifted. No longer was this a simple trial. It was an exposure of corruption at the highest level. Judge Barrett's face turned a deep shade of red as he slammed his gavel. "Order in the court," he shouted, his voice strained, his authority slipping. But it was too late. The truth was out. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to realization. Some members whispered among themselves, while others sat rigid, their eyes locked onto the judge. A few even looked disgusted, the weight of what had just been revealed settling over them like a storm cloud. The prosecutor cleared his throat, forcing confidence into his tone. "This could be a forgery," he snapped. waving a dismissive hand at the receipt. Elijah didn't hesitate. "Then check the store cameras," he shot back. "It's all there." The courtroom buzzed with renewed energy. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, while the murmurs among the spectators grew louder. Even the bailiff shifted uneasily, as if realizing the balance of power in the room had changed. Judge Barrett slammed his gavel again. "This is highly irregular," he barked, his voice betraying the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The defense lawyer stood, his expression unreadable. But his next words sent a wave of tension crashing through the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm, "this is tampering with evidence. And if this was hidden, how many other cases were?" Silence. Judge Barrett's mouth tightened, his grip on the gavel turning his knuckles white. His usual air of control, his ability to command the room with just a glance, gone. He had nothing to say, no quick-witted retort, no way to shift the blame. The accusations hung in the air, waiting to be answered. The jury watched him closely. The reporters leaned in. The activists in the back of the courtroom exchanged knowing glances. For the first time in his career, Judge Barrett wasn't the one controlling the narrative. Elijah had done the impossible. He had put the judge on the defensive. The weight of the courtroom's silence pressed down like a thick fog. The prosecutor shuffled his papers, searching for a rebuttal, but the damage had already been done. The defense lawyer took a step forward, placing the receipt back on the table. "This isn't just a mistake," he continued. "This is a pattern, a deliberate attempt to manipulate the outcome of a trial." More murmurs spread through the room. One of the jurors, an older woman with sharp eyes, leaned toward her fellow jurors, whispering something urgent. The others nodded. Judge Barrett inhaled deeply, setting his gavel down instead of slamming it. "This court will take a recess," he announced, though his voice lacked the authority it once held. "I will review the evidence further." But the damage was done. Elijah turned toward his father, who sat still, his expression unreadable. But in his eyes there was something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Outside the courtroom doors, reporters were already preparing their headlines. The buzz of camera shutters and hurried conversations filled the hallways. "Elijah Walker just changed the game," one journalist muttered to another. Elijah clenched his fists at his sides, not in anger but in determination. This wasn't over yet. He had done more than stand up to the judge. He had forced the entire system to look in the mirror. The jury had been gone for less than an hour. The courtroom remained silent, the tension unbearable. Every person in the room knew what was at stake. Justice for David Walker, a father wrongfully accused, and the reputation of Judge Barrett, a man whose power was slipping through his fingers. Judge Barrett sat rigidly at the bench, his face unreadable. His voice was tight as he finally spoke. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice, stood. "We have, Your Honor." Elijah held his breath, gripping the edge of the defense table. His father sat beside him, his hands clasped tightly together. This was it. This was the moment that could either set them free or confirm that the system had failed them once again. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson cleared her throat. "On the charge of burglary, we find the defendant, David Walker, not guilty." For a moment, there was silence, as if the entire room had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Then, an eruption of noise. Cheers rang out from the gallery. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Activists embraced, their fight finally yielding a victory. Elijah closed his eyes for just a second, exhaling as relief washed over him. When he opened them, his father was looking at him, eyes filled with gratitude and something Elijah hadn't seen in weeks: peace. Before he could say anything, his father pulled him into a tight hug. "You did it," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." Elijah shook his head. "We saved each other." The defense lawyer turned to shake David's hand. "This case is bigger than just one man," he said. "Your son exposed a system that was never meant to protect you." Judge Barrett slammed his gavel, his face red with frustration. "Order in the court," he barked, but the command held no power anymore. And then, just when the celebration was reaching its peak, the defense lawyer raised his voice over the commotion. "Your Honor, we have filed an official complaint against you." The courtroom hushed once more. The judge's mouth tightened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his bench. The evidence tampering in this case is just one example of a long history of bias in your courtroom. The lawyer continued. The legal board will be conducting a full investigation into your past rulings. Gasps spread through the room. Reporters rushed to document the moment, cameras flashing, pens flying across notepads. Elijah turned to look at Judge Barrett. For the first time, the man who had ruled over so many lives with an iron fist had no words, no excuses, no way out. But the truth was out, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elijah had won. But what happened next stunned everyone. The very next day, headlines across the city told the story. Judge Barrett under investigation for wrongful convictions. News outlets revealed years of misconduct, dozens of cases where innocent black men had been sentenced without fair trials. The very system he had controlled was now turning against him. A full investigation into his rulings was announced. The legal board moved swiftly, re-examining every case he had presided over. Families who had suffered under his judgments came forward, demanding justice for their loved ones. And now, the once powerful judge who had silenced so many was the one being forced to answer for his actions. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Elijah as he walked with his father. Cameras flashed, microphones were pushed toward him, voices overlapping as they all wanted the same thing: his story. "Elijah, how did you know to look for the receipt?" one reporter asked. Elijah stopped, glancing at his father before answering. He shrugged, his voice calm despite the overwhelming attention. "My dad always taught me to keep proof." David Walker placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. "You saved me, son," he said softly. Elijah met his father's gaze. "I want to help other people like us." David smiled, nodding. "And you will." As they walked away from the cameras, the weight of everything that had happened settled over Elijah. His father was free. Judge Barrett was finally facing the consequences of his corruption. But this fight wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the people who had been forgotten, the ones who had never been given a voice. In the weeks that followed, Elijah's story spread far beyond New Orleans. Activists used his case as a rallying cry for criminal justice reform. Organizations reached out, wanting to support him in his mission. People he had never met sent letters, thanking him for standing up when so many others had been too afraid. One afternoon, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a stack of envelopes. Some were from reporters, others from former inmates who had been wrongfully convicted. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, caught his eye. It was from a man who had spent 15 years behind bars due to one of Judge Barrett's rulings. "Thank you for speaking up," the letter read. "Because of you, I might get my second chance." Elijah set the letter down, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something bigger. He had won his fight that day. But in the end, he had started a movement.